The axe blade caught moonlight as it descended toward Leopold Gainsworth's neck. His scream died in the Newfoundland wilderness, swallowed by wind that had carried such sounds before. This is the story of how an entire mountain range became a hunting ground, and why some trails should never be walked alone. The year 1829 brought unusual warmth to the Appalachian reaches of Newfoundland, where spruce needles crackled underfoot, and the air tasted of iron and distant snow. Mist clung to granite outcroppings, like fingers reluctant to let go, and somewhere in those ancient valleys, Drusilla Pembroke waited with the patience of stone itself. She had learned long ago that travelers revealed themselves through sound before sight. The snap of dry branches, the scrape of boot leather against rock, the labored breathing of men unaccustomed to thin mountain air. Leopold Gainsworth, a cartographer from St. John's, had departed the coastal settlement of Trinity Bay on September 15th with provisions for a 3-week survey expedition. His mission was simple: map the unexplored watersheds between the Avalon Peninsula and the interior highlands, documenting potential routes for future timber operations. What the colonial authorities didn't know was that these mountains already had a guardian one who viewed every footfall as trespass and every surveyor stake as desecration. Official records from the Newfoundland Colonial Office describe Gainsworth as methodical and experienced in wilderness navigation. His journals, recovered months later, painted a different picture in their final entries. September 28th. Compass readings inconsistent. Trail markers moved or destroyed. September 30th. Sense of being observed. Game trails lead to clearings that feel arranged. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Drusilla Pembroke had been watching him since his second day in the mountains. Born to Appalachian settlers who had migrated north during the American colonial period, Drusilla understood these peaks in ways that escaped government cartographers. Every deer path, every hidden spring, every cave that could shelter a hunter through the killing months, and she knew them all. More importantly, she knew how to use them as tools. Her cabin sat in a hollow so perfectly concealed that smoke from her chimney dispersed through a natural rock formation, invisible from any angle a traveler might approach. Inside, shelves lined with preserving jars caught lamplight, their contents floating in brine too dark to identify clearly. A collection of walking sticks leaned against the far wall: ash, hickory, pine, each carved with initials that belonged to men who no longer needed them. But Drusilla's true workshop lay deeper in the mountains, where she had spent years perfecting her craft. A network of hidden pitfalls covered with pine boughs and moss, snares positioned at precise intervals along the most logical camping spots, deadfalls triggered by the simple act of gathering firewood. She had transformed 20 square miles of wilderness into an intricate trap designed to capture those who presumed to chart her domain. October first marked the beginning of what local authorities would later call the vanishing season. Gainsworth's final journal entry, dated October 2nd, contained just 4 words: "She knows I'm here." When search parties eventually found his camp, 3 weeks later, everything remained exactly as he had left. Its tent properly staked, food stores intact, surveying equipment arranged with military precision. Only the man himself had disappeared, along with his rifle and a single cooking pot. The search leader, Nathaniel Hardcastle of the Trinity Bay Constabulary, noted something peculiar in his official report. The campsite showed no signs of struggle, no indication of wild animal attack, no evidence of hasty departure. Yet deep gouges marked several nearby trees, made by something sharp and deliberate, almost like territorial markings. What Hardcastle couldn't have known was that Drusilla had watched his search party from a ledge 200 yards above their position. She observed them methodically, catalog evidence that meant nothing, document clues that led nowhere, and eventually retreat to the safety of their settlement with theories that explained nothing. Their failure satisfied her completely. The mountains had claimed another surveyor, and autumn was just beginning. But as October's chill descended through the valleys, disturbing news reached Trinity Bay through trading posts and trappers' reports. Gainsworth hadn't been the only traveler to vanish in the highlands that season. 2 fur traders, a Methodist missionary, and a geological prospector had all entered the mountain passes in recent weeks. None had returned. What connected these disappearances wasn't immediately obvious to colonial authorities, puzzling over incomplete reports and conflicting witness statements. They couldn't have imagined that their missing men had encountered something far more dangerous than bears or treacherous terrain. A predator who understood that the key to perfect hunting wasn't strength or speed, but infinite patience and intimate knowledge of the ground. How long can civilization ignore what it refuses to understand? And what happens when the wilderness decides to push back? Winter was coming to the Appalachian peaks, and Drusilla Pembroke had begun to expand her territory. Before we go deeper into these mountain disappearances, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If this story is keeping you up past your bedtime, hit that like button and subscribe, because the truth about what happened in those peaks gets much darker from here. The sound of splintering bone echoed through Reverend Sybil Renford's final prayers. Her hymnal lay open to page 27, blood-stained and forgotten in the morning frost. What happened next would force an entire colonial administration to confront the possibility that some evil couldn't be explained by church doctrine or civil law. Trinity Bay's Methodist Chapel smelled of whale oil and desperation on the morning of October 10th, 1829, when Constable Nathaniel Hardcastle delivered news that would shatter any illusion of safety the coastal settlement had maintained. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of worried congregants, while outside, harbor seals barked warnings from ice-slicked rocks. Inside, the taste of fear was as tangible as the salt air that seeped through every gap in the chapel's hastily constructed walls. Reverend Renford had vanished 6 days earlier while conducting missionary work among the scattered homesteads that dotted the mountain approaches. Unlike the cartographer Gainsworth, whose disappearance could be attributed to the inherent dangers of wilderness survey work, Renford represented something more troubling: the loss of moral authority in a region that desperately needed guidance. Her mission had been simple: deliver communion supplies to isolated families before the winter freeze made mountain travel impossible. The Appalachian settlements, populated largely by American immigrants seeking refuge from political turmoil, maintained a tenuous connection to colonial religious life. Renford's monthly visits provided their only link to organized Christianity, carrying news from the coast along with sacramental wine and carefully wrapped communion wafers. From the Trinity Bay Methodist Archives, October 4th, 1829, Reverend S. Renford departed at dawn with provisions for 7 homesteads. Expected return, October 8th. Horse well rested, weather favorable. But Renford's route took her directly through territory that Drusilla Pembroke had begun to consider her personal preserve. The Reverend's first 3 stops proceeded without incident. The Coldwell family received their communion supplies gratefully, as did the Blackwells and the remote cabin belonging to old Ebenezer Thornfield. Each homestead offered the same reports game had grown scarce. Strange sounds echoed through the valleys at night, and several families had discovered elaborate snares near their properties, far more sophisticated than anything local trappers might construct. Renford documented these concerns in her journal, attributing them to the natural anxiety that accompanied autumn's approach in wilderness settlements. What she failed to recognize was that every family she visited had been under observation for weeks, their routines cataloged, their vulnerabilities assessed by someone who understood that information was the deadliest weapon in any hunter's arsenal. The Reverend's 4th stop, at the isolated homestead of Augusta Pennington, would be her last. Pennington lived alone in a clearing that required 3 hours of difficult riding to reach, her cabin positioned where 2 deer trails converged near a natural spring. A widow whose husband had died in a logging accident 2 years earlier, she had chosen solitude over the uncertain charity of town life. Her homestead represented the extreme edge of Methodist missionary territory, the final outpost before the mountains swallowed all traces of civilization. When Renford arrived on October 5th, she found Pennington in a state of barely controlled terror. "She's been watching," the widow whispered, gesturing toward the tree line that pressed close around her small clearing. "3 nights running. I've seen her moving through the pines, never the same place twice, never making a sound, but always there." Renford attempted to provide rational explanations. Wildlife, perhaps a lost traveler, tricks of lamplight and shadow, but Pennington's description contained details that defied such comfort. The watcher was definitely female, definitely human, and moved through the forest with an unnatural understanding of how to remain invisible while making her presence felt. Death was reshaping the mountains. More disturbing still, Pennington had discovered evidence of deliberate manipulation around her property. Tool handles had been subtly loosened so they would fail during critical tasks. Her well rope showed signs of careful fraying that would cause it to snap under load. Even her cabin's door hinges had been tampered with, adjusted so they would squeal at the slightest movement, announcing her location to anyone listening in the darkness. "Someone wants me to leave," Pennington explained, "but they want me to leave frightened." Renford spent that night in Pennington's cabin, offering prayers and attempting to restore the widow's shaken faith. Her journal entry from October 5th reveals growing unease. Mrs. P's fears appear well-founded. Observed unusual light patterns in forest after midnight. No natural explanation readily apparent. What Renford couldn't have known was that Drusilla Pembroke had been testing new methods of psychological pressure, refining techniques that would drive isolated settlers to abandon their claims without requiring direct confrontation. Fear, properly applied, could clear territory more efficiently than violence while leaving no evidence for colonial authorities to investigate. But the Reverend's presence complicated Drusilla's careful plans. A Methodist missionary represented outside authority, someone whose disappearance would trigger organized searches and unwanted attention. Unlike vanished surveyors or traders, a missing member of the clergy would demand answers that the colonial administration couldn't ignore. Drusilla found herself facing a choice between abandoning her expanding territory or escalating to methods that would leave no room for subtlety. She chose escalation. Renford's horse was found on October 7th, grazing peacefully near Pennington Spring. The animal showed no signs of distress, its tack properly secured, saddlebags containing communion supplies still carefully wrapped. But Reverend Renford herself had simply vanished, as if she had dismounted for a moment and forgotten to exist. Pennington's account of that final morning contained contradictions that frustrated investigators. She insisted the Reverend had departed at sunrise, exactly as planned, but couldn't explain why the horse had returned without its rider. She claimed to have heard normal sounds of departure hoofbeats, the minister's voice offering a final blessing, yet admitted she hadn't actually watched Renford leave the clearing. The widow's memory, it seemed, had been carefully edited. What really happened in those pre-dawn moments remained Drusilla Pembroke's secret, filed away with growing expertise in the management of witnesses and the manipulation of evidence. But the Reverend's disappearance marked a crucial shift in the mountain predator's methodology, a transition from opportunistic hunting to systematic territorial expansion. How do you hunt someone whose disappearance will be noticed? And what happens when even God's representatives aren't safe in the wilderness? By October's end, 3 more homesteads had been mysteriously abandoned, their families fleeing to the coast with stories too frightening to believe. Theophilus Marchant's brass buttons caught firelight as he studied the map spread across Trinity Bay's courthouse table. Red pins marked 7 disappearances in 6 weeks. Too many for coincidence, too few for panic. The colonial government was about to learn that some mysteries grow more dangerous the deeper you dig. November wind howled through Trinity Bay's narrow streets on the 15th, carrying the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter down from the Appalachian peaks. Inside the courthouse, a hastily convened emergency session brought together every available authority from the Avalon Peninsula, magistrates, constables, military officers, and one very uncomfortable special commissioner sent directly from St. John's to address what the governor's office had begun calling the mountain situation. Commissioner Marchant had built his reputation on solving problems that embarrassed the colonial administration. A former Army investigator with experience in the American frontier territories, he understood wilderness dangers and the psychology of isolated settlements. What he didn't understand was how 7 healthy adults could simply vanish from an area smaller than most English counties without leaving traces that experienced trackers could follow. The courthouse's main chamber smelled of wet wool and nervous sweat as Marchant addressed the assembled officials. Outside, sleet tapped against windows that overlooked Trinity Bay's gray harbor, where fishing boats rode at anchor, their crews reluctant to venture inland for winter supplies. The sound of wooden hulls grinding against dock pilings provided an ominous rhythm to proceedings that would reshape how Newfoundland's government approached frontier security. "Gentlemen," Marchant began, consulting notes written in precise military script, "we face circumstances that challenge conventional investigation methods. 7 confirmed disappearances, 5 potential cases still under review, and a pattern that suggests either organized criminal activity or," he paused, choosing words carefully, "or factors beyond our current understanding." Constable Hardcastle provided the official summary, his voice betraying strain that 6 weeks of fruitless searching had embedded deep in his bones. The cartographer Gainsworth had vanished September 30th. Reverend Renford disappeared October 5th. 2 fur traders, Horatio Coldwell and Verity Blackwell, had entered the mountains October 12th and never emerged. A geological prospector named Millicent Waverly had last been seen October 20th near the headwaters of Trinity River. But the cases that troubled Marchant most involved entire families. The Thornfield homestead had been abandoned sometime during the 3rd week of October, discovered empty by neighbors who'd come to check on elderly Ebenezer Thornfield and his 2 grown sons. Their cabin showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of hasty departure, no indication where 3 generations of mountain farmers had gone. Food remained on the table, partially eaten and covered with frost. Livestock wandered free in their yard, unfed but unharmed. Most disturbing, the Thornfield family Bible lay open on their kitchen table to the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verse 8. "And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." Someone had underlined the passage in fresh ink. The mountains were teaching new lessons. Similar discoveries awaited investigators at the Waverly homestead, abandoned around the same time with identical mysterious circumstances. Personal belongings remained undisturbed, valuable items left behind, but the family themselves had simply ceased to exist. Their neighbors, the Penningtons, reported seeing strange lights moving through the forest in the weeks before both families disappeared, not campfires or lanterns, but something that seemed to drift between the trees with deliberate purpose. Marchant's military background had taught him to look for patterns that revealed enemy tactics, and the evidence suggested a sophisticated adversary who understood psychological warfare. The abandoned homesteads weren't random targets, but carefully selected pressure points designed to destabilize the entire mountain settlement network. Someone was systematically driving colonists away from territory they wanted to claim as their own. But who possessed such detailed knowledge of local geography, family routines, and community relationships? The commissioner's investigation revealed disturbing gaps in colonial records regarding the mountain region's earliest settlers. Official immigration documents tracked families arriving through St. John's and other coastal ports, but the Appalachian Hollows had also attracted refugees who'd entered Newfoundland through unofficial channels. American colonists fleeing political persecution, displaced Acadian families, even former soldiers seeking isolation after traumatic military service. Among these unofficial residents, one name appeared repeatedly in fragmentary records and second-hand accounts: Pembroke. A trapper named Samuel Brewster, interviewed November 20th at Trinity Bay's Tavern, provided the most detailed description available. "Drusilla Pembroke's been in those mountains longer than anyone can recall," he explained, nervous hands wrapped around a pewter mug of rum. Her family came up from the Carolinas maybe 20 years back, after some trouble with Cherokee raids. She was barely grown then, but already knew the woods, like they'd taught her everything worth knowing. Brewster's account contained details that made Marchant take careful notes. Drusilla lived alone in a cabin so well hidden that even experienced hunters had trouble finding it twice. She traded occasionally at remote settlements, exchanging furs and preserved meat for essential supplies, but never revealed her exact location or stayed long enough for extended conversation. Most significantly, she possessed skills that seemed beyond what any settler should have acquired through normal frontier life. "She moves through trees like smoke," Brewster whispered, glancing toward the tavern's windows as if expecting observation. "Can track game through country, where other folks see nothing but rocks and thorn bushes. Some say she learned hunting secrets from natives before they moved west. Others claim she figured things out on her own that nobody should know." The trapper's description included in detail that particularly interested Marchant: Drusilla's apparent ability to predict when strangers would enter her territory, sometimes positioning herself along their routes days before they arrived. Such knowledge suggested either supernatural perception or an extensive network of informants, both possibilities that challenged conventional law enforcement approaches. But Brewster's most troubling revelation concerned recent changes in Drusilla's behavior. "She used to keep to herself, avoid contact with settlement folk," he explained. "But this year's been different. She's been asking questions about who comes and goes, which families live where, what routes the government men use for their surveys. Like she's planning something that requires knowing everybody else's business." Marchant closed his notebook slowly, understanding that his investigation had identified a suspect who possessed every advantage in her home territory. Drusilla Pembroke knew the mountains intimately, while colonial authorities struggled to navigate terrain that could hide a dozen armies. She understood the psychology of isolated settlers, while government officials applied coastal logic to wilderness problems. Most importantly, she had apparently decided that coexistence was no longer acceptable. How do you arrest someone who can disappear into territory that maps can't chart? And what happens when the hunt becomes a war? Winter was closing the mountain passes, but Commissioner Marchant had already decided that spring would bring a reckoning. Steam rose from Commissioner Marchant's coffee as he watched 12 armed men prepare for a hunt that might cost half their lives. The taste of mountain mist already carried promises of violence. This expedition would either end Drusilla Pembroke's reign of terror or prove that some predators can't be caged by civilized law. The ice broke early that year on Trinity River, filling the valley with sounds like distant cannon fire as winter's grip loosened across the Appalachian peaks. By April 15th, 1830, colonial authorities had assembled the largest manhunt in Newfoundland's recorded history. 12 constables, 6 military volunteers, 2 Mi'kmaq trackers, and Commissioner Marchant himself, all equipped for extended wilderness operations. The expedition's official mandate was simple: locate and arrest Drusilla Pembroke for questioning regarding multiple disappearances. The reality promised to be considerably more complex. Marchant had spent the winter months studying every available account of the mountain woman, assembling a profile that read like something from frontier legend rather than police records. Drusilla Pembroke, approximately 40 years old, stood nearly 6 feet tall with the lean build of someone who'd survived decades of wilderness living. Her hair had turned prematurely silver, which locals claimed made her even more difficult to spot. against granite outcroppings and snow-covered pine boughs. But physical description mattered less than documented capabilities. According to witnesses, Drusilla could track game across terrain that left experienced hunters bewildered, moving through dense forest without creating detectable noise or disturbance. She understood weather patterns well enough to predict storms days in advance, knowledge that allowed her to position herself advantageously while others sought shelter. Most troubling, she seemed to possess an uncanny ability to anticipate human behavior, appearing along travelers' routes as if she'd known their plans before they'd made them. From the Trinity Bay Constabulary Files, April 10, 1830, subject demonstrates exceptional wilderness skills, consistent with extended isolation training. Recommend armed approach with maximum precautions. The expedition departed Trinity Bay on April 20th, following the inland route that had carried so many previous travelers to their disappearances. Marchant's strategy relied on superior numbers and careful coordination, using the Mi'kmaq trackers to identify signs that European eyes might miss, while maintaining constant communication between team members to prevent individual targeting. What he couldn't anticipate was how thoroughly Drusilla had prepared for exactly this sort of confrontation. The first day proceeded without incident, the expedition making good time through familiar territory, where logging roads provided clear passage toward the mountain approaches. But as they moved beyond the last settled homesteads, subtle signs began to appear that suggested they were entering carefully prepared ground. Game trails had been modified to funnel travelers toward specific passages. Natural landmarks had been altered in ways that would confuse navigation. Even the placement of fallen trees seemed designed to channel movement along predetermined routes. Constable James Wicklow, a veteran of frontier police work, noted these modifications in his journal. Country appears normal, but feels managed. Suspect we are being guided rather than exploring freely. By evening of the second day, the expedition had established camp near the abandoned Thornfield homestead, using the empty cabin as a base for systematic searches of the surrounding territory. The building's interior remained exactly as investigators had found it months earlier. Personal belongings undisturbed, family Bible open to the Book of Revelation, no indication where 3 generations of mountain farmers had gone. But that night, the expedition learned that their presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Sentries reported strange sounds moving through the forest. Around their perimeter, not wildlife, but careful footsteps that seemed to circle their position without coming close enough for visual contact. Twice during the night, guards thought they detected the silhouette of a tall figure observing them from the tree line. But when they investigated, they found only disturbed pine needles and the faint scent of wood smoke that seemed to drift from no identifiable source. The mountains remembered every footstep. Dawn revealed evidence that someone had approached their camp during the night shift change. Boot prints circled their position, following a route that demonstrated intimate knowledge of sentry patterns and blind spots. More unsettling, several of the expedition's horses showed signs of having been examined bridles, carefully inspected, saddle cinches tested, provision packs opened and resealed with precision that suggested professional interest rather than opportunistic theft. She's studying us, Marchant realized, examining the tracks with growing unease, learning our capabilities, testing our defenses, planning her response. The Mi'kmaq trackers, brothers named Joseph and Matthew Cope, provided insights that made the situation even more ominous. The tracks belonged to someone who moved through the forest with skills that exceeded normal wilderness experience. Someone who understood hunting techniques that went beyond simple survival knowledge. The boot prints showed modifications, leather soles, cut in patterns that would provide silent movement across different terrain types, heels worn down in ways that suggested extensive practice in stalking prey. This woman hunts men like moose, Joseph Cope explained quietly. She knows we are here before we know she is watching. The expedition's third day brought their first direct encounter with Drusilla's handiwork. Following a game trail toward the suspected location of her hidden cabin. The search party discovered a clearing that contained evidence of systematic butchering operations. Multiple fire pits, carefully arranged for different cooking methods. Wooden racks designed for smoking meat, positioned to catch prevailing winds. Stone slabs that had been shaped into cutting surfaces, stained dark with use. But the most disturbing discovery lay partially buried beneath a pile of ash and bone fragments. Personal effects, carefully sorted and preserved, leather pouches, metal buckles, wooden combs, bone buttons, items that told stories of lives ended and carefully cataloged. Among them, Constable Hardcastle identified a brass surveyor's compass that had belonged to Leopold Gainsworth, the cartographer who disappeared the previous September. Nearby, they found Reverend Renford's pocket watch, its crystal cracked, but mechanism still functional. Marchant studied the arrangement with growing horror, understanding that they'd discovered more than a crime scene. This was a workshop, a place where Drusilla had perfected techniques for processing her victims with methodical efficiency. The personal effects weren't trophies, but practical resources, metal items that could be repurposed, leather goods that retained value, bone and antler that served multiple wilderness functions. "She's been hunting people for years," he whispered to Constable Hardcastle. "We're not tracking a murderer who happened to choose this territory. We're pursuing someone who sees human beings as a renewable resource." The search party made camp that evening in a defensive position overlooking the clearing, rotating guards every 2 hours and maintaining constant vigilance against an opponent who clearly possessed every tactical advantage in her home territory. They had found evidence of Drusilla's activities, but the woman herself remained as elusive as mountain mist. What they didn't realize was that she had been watching them discover her workshop, evaluating their reactions, and planning her response to their invasion of her domain. How do you hunt someone who treats your expedition as target practice? And what happens when the predator decides to stop observing and start eliminating threats? The fourth day would bring answers that half the expedition wouldn't survive to remember. Constable Wicklow's scream cut through morning mist like a blade through silk. When the echo faded, only 11 men remained to hunt the woman who had already begun hunting them. The expedition was about to learn that in Drusilla Pembroke's territory, visitors didn't choose when the game began or ended. Dawn on April 24th broke gray and cold across the Appalachian peaks, with fog so thick it muffled sound and turned familiar shapes into threatening shadows. Commissioner Marchant had positioned his men in a defensive perimeter around their camp, each constable assigned specific fields of observation to prevent the surprise approaches that had characterized their previous nights. But Drusilla Pembroke had spent 20 years perfecting techniques that rendered such precautions useless. The attack began before anyone realized it had started. Wicklow had been assigned the Eastern Watch, positioned where a granite outcropping provided clear sight lines down the slope toward Trinity River. His orders were simple: maintain visual contact with the next sentry position, report any movement or unusual sounds, rotate guard duty every 2 hours to prevent fatigue errors. What those orders couldn't account for was an opponent who moved through terrain like water flowing around obstacles, someone who understood exactly how to approach a trained soldier without triggering the instincts that kept frontier lawmen alive. The first indication of trouble came not from Wicklow's position, but from the absence of his scheduled hourly signal, a specific whistle pattern that confirmed alertness and readiness. When 15 minutes passed without contact, Sergeant Morrison moved to investigate, following the careful approach protocols that Marchant had drilled into every expedition member. He found Wicklow's position empty, rifle leaning against the granite outcropping, exactly where it had been placed, powder horn and shot pouch undisturbed, telescope extended and focused on the valley below. Everything suggested a man who had simply stepped away momentarily, perhaps to relieve himself or investigate a suspicious sound. But Wicklow himself had vanished as completely as if the mountain mist had swallowed him, Morrison's shout brought the entire expedition to full alert. Weapons ready, formation tight. They searched the immediate area systematically, looking for tracks, blood, signs of struggle, any indication of what had happened to their missing comrade. The Mi'kmaq trackers, Joseph and Matthew Cope, found evidence that made the situation even more ominous. Wicklow's boots had left clear impressions in the soft earth around his position, but the tracks told a story that defied logical explanation. The prints showed normal pacing patterns for approximately 30 minutes, then stopped abruptly mid-stride. No signs of a second person approaching, no indication of struggle or sudden movement, just footprints that ended as if their maker had been lifted into the air. "Impossible," Marchant muttered, examining the tracks himself. Men don't just disappear without leaving traces. But Matthew Cope pointed toward the tree line, where subtle disturbances in the undergrowth suggested a different explanation. Someone with exceptional skill had approached Wicklow's position from uphill, moving through terrain so difficult that normal tracking methods failed to detect passage. The approach route utilized natural cover so effectively that an observer would remain invisible until the final moment of contact. Death stalked with professional precision. 20 yards beyond Wicklow's abandoned post, Joseph Cope discovered the first trace of what had happened. A small depression in the pine needles, roughly the size and shape of a kneeling human figure, positioned where an archer might take aim at the sentry position. No arrows were found, no obvious weapons discarded, but the depression suggested someone had waited patiently for the perfect moment to act. "She watched him," Cope explained quietly, "learned his patterns, planned her approach, chose her moment." The search for additional clues yielded more disturbing discoveries. Broken pine branches, arranged in subtle patterns that seemed designed to guide pursuit in specific directions. Disturbed earth that suggested recent digging and careful concealment. Most unsettling, a series of small cairns, carefully stacked stones positioned at regular intervals, leading deeper into the mountains, as if marking a trail that Drusilla wanted them to follow. Marchant faced a decision that would determine the expedition's fate. They could retreat to Trinity Bay, report Wicklow's disappearance, and recommend a larger military operation with better equipment and more personnel. Or they could pursue their quarry into territory that clearly favored her tactical advantages, risking additional casualties, but maintaining the initiative that had taken months to establish. The commissioner chose pursuit, reasoning that Drusilla's boldness indicated desperation rather than confidence. A truly secure predator wouldn't risk direct confrontation with armed authorities, but someone feeling territorial pressure might make mistakes that skilled hunters could exploit. The expedition moved deeper into the mountains, following the cairn trail with weapons ready and senses alert for ambush. The path led through increasingly difficult terrain, narrow passages between granite walls, stream crossings that required single-file movement, dense thickets that limited visibility to mere yards. Each step took them further from familiar territory and deeper into country where their opponent possessed every conceivable advantage. By afternoon, they discovered evidence that Wicklow wasn't Drusilla's first victim that day. A mile beyond the morning's confrontation site, the expedition found signs of a temporary camp that had been abandoned in apparent haste. Gear scattered across a small clearing, cold ashes from a hastily extinguished fire, and tracks indicating that someone had departed quickly toward the northeast. But among the scattered equipment, Constable Hardcastle identified items that belonged to previous expedition members, personal effects from disappeared travelers, carefully organized as if displayed for inspection. Leopold Gainsworth's surveying instruments, now modified for different purposes. Reverend Renford's Bible, with specific passages marked in what appeared to be dried blood. Most disturbing, a collection of scalping knives arranged in precise patterns around a central fire pit, still warm to the touch. She's been preparing for this confrontation, Marchant realized, studying the abandoned camp with growing unease. Everything we've found has been deliberately placed to communicate specific messages. But what message was Drusilla trying to send? The answer came as evening approached and the expedition made camp in a defensive position overlooking a narrow valley. As sentries took their positions and cooking fires were lit, a sound echoed across the mountains that made every man reach for his weapon. A long, mournful howl that seemed part human, part predator, and entirely unnatural. The sound repeated 3 times, each repetition coming from a different direction, suggesting multiple sources or someone with extraordinary mobility. Between the howls, they could hear something else. Wicklow's voice, calling for help from somewhere in the darkness beyond their perimeter. Marchand ordered the men to hold position, understanding that Drusilla was using their missing comrade as bait for additional attacks. But Wicklow's cries grew more desperate, more agonized, until maintaining discipline required every ounce of military training the expedition possessed. How long can trained men listen to a comrade's suffering without abandoning tactical sense? And what happens when compassion becomes a weapon in enemy hands? The night was about to teach them that some hunts end only when the last hunter falls. Wicklow's final scream shattered the mountain silence just as Sergeant Morrison's throat opened under Drusilla's blade. 2 men down, 9 remaining, and the darkness was just beginning. The expedition was learning that some predators save their most lethal techniques for after sunset. The attack came at 11:47 p.m., precisely when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb during night watch rotation. Commissioner Marchand had positioned his remaining men in overlapping fields of fire, each sentry supporting the next in a defensive arrangement that should have prevented individual targeting. But Drusilla Pembroke had spent decades perfecting methods that turned such preparations into tactical disadvantages. The first indication that their perimeter had been breached came not from sentries, but from the horses, whose sudden agitation suggested something dangerous moving beyond the firelight's reach. The animals stamped and whinnied nervously, pulling against their tethers with an urgency that experienced frontiersmen recognized as fear of predators. But when guards investigated the source of disturbance, they found only darkness and the oppressive sense of being observed by something that understood their every movement. Drusilla had infiltrated their camp, using techniques that bordered on supernatural. Moving with the patience of stone and the silence of falling snow, she had approached their position during the evening's shift change, timing her advance to coincide with the brief moments when sentry attention focused inward rather than outward. Her route utilized every natural depression, every shadow, every blind spot that the expedition's defensive positioning had inadvertently created. The Mi'kmaq tracker Joseph Cope later described finding evidence of her approach. She moved like water, finding cracks in rock, every step planned, every movement calculated to avoid detection. But Drusilla's infiltration served purposes beyond simple assassination. She had spent the early evening hours studying her targets, learning individual behaviors, and identifying psychological pressure points that could be exploited during sustained psychological warfare. Some men responded to direct threats, others to uncertain danger. Some maintained discipline under pressure, others cracked when isolated from group support. Understanding these differences allowed her to customize her attacks for maximum disruption of expedition morale and tactical cohesion. Wicklow's cries had been part of this psychological preparation, designed to strain expedition, discipline, and identify which members might break ranks to attempt rescue operations. When no one responded to his apparent distress, Drusilla adjusted her strategy accordingly, understanding that she faced opponents with sufficient training to resist emotional manipulation. The mountains taught patience and precision. Morrison's death came first, silent and surgical, as Drusilla approached his position during a moment when fog and darkness provided perfect concealment. The sergeant never saw his killer, never had opportunity to raise an alarm or defend himself. One moment he stood guard over the eastern approach. The next, his body lay cooling among the pine needles while his blood soaked into earth that had absorbed such offerings before. His disappearance might have gone unnoticed for hours, if not for the careful positioning of his corpse. Drusilla had arranged Morrison's body where it would be discovered quickly, understanding that finding a mutilated comrade would destabilize expedition morale more effectively than simple disappearance. The psychological impact of visual confirmation, the precise cuts, the methodical removal of equipment, the almost ritualistic positioning served her tactical objectives better than mere elimination. Constable Davies found Morrison's remains at midnight during routine position checks, his horrified shout alerting the entire camp to their compromised situation. The remaining expedition members formed a tight defensive circle, weapons ready, while Marchant attempted to maintain order among men who were beginning to understand that their opponent possessed capabilities beyond normal human limitations. "She's inside our perimeter," Marchant announced grimly. "From this point forward, no one moves alone, no one strays beyond visual contact, and no one assumes we're safe until dawn." But dawn was still 6 hours away, and Drusilla had only begun to demonstrate her capabilities. The second attack targeted their communications, eliminating the expedition's ability to coordinate effective responses to multiple threats. Using throwing knives with accuracy that suggested years of practice, she struck sentries in positions where their deaths would create the largest gaps in defensive coverage. Each killing was precisely timed to prevent victims from raising alarms, while simultaneously forcing survivors to redeploy in ways that opened new vulnerabilities. Constables Bradley and Henley died within minutes of each other, their throats opened by blades thrown from positions that seemed impossible, given the terrain and available cover. In both cases, the weapons struck with enough force to penetrate leather and flesh, while maintaining accuracy across distances that challenged expert marksmen using firearms. The expedition's defensive perimeter collapsed as survivors pulled back toward their central fire, abandoning the outer positions that had become death traps rather than defensive advantages. 7 men remained operational, huddled together in a space barely 20 feet across, while something circled them in the darkness with the persistence of a wolf pack, but the intelligence of a military strategist. Matthew Cope, the remaining Mi'kmaq tracker, provided insights that made their situation even more ominous. She is not hunting for food or territory. This is war, and she intends to eliminate every threat to her domain. Drusilla's strategy had evolved beyond simple predation to territorial cleansing, a campaign designed to remove colonial presence from her mountain stronghold permanently. The expedition represented the most serious challenge to her authority that government forces had ever mounted, and her response demonstrated capabilities that suggested years of preparation for exactly this sort of confrontation. At 2:15 a.m., she made her boldest move yet. A burning arrow struck the expedition's supply cache, igniting gunpowder and provisions in a ram, explosion that illuminated the surrounding forest for several hundred yards. In that brief moment of firelight, the survivors caught their first clear glimpse of their tormentor, a tall figure moving between the trees with fluid grace, carrying a recurved bow and wearing clothing that seemed designed to blend with shadows and bark. But the explosion served purposes beyond psychological intimidation. It destroyed most of the expedition's ammunition, food, and medical supplies, ensuring that any survivors would face a desperate retreat through hostile territory without adequate resources. More importantly, it demonstrated that Drusilla could strike their most heavily defended positions whenever she chose. The message was unmistakable: surrender or die. Commissioner Marchant studied his remaining men in the flickering light of scattered fires, understanding that they faced an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything in his military experience. 7 constables, 1 tracker, himself 9 men against a woman who seemed to possess superhuman abilities and intimate knowledge of terrain that maps couldn't chart. How do you fight an enemy who turns your strengths into weaknesses? And what happens when retreat becomes impossible in country that belongs entirely to your opponent? The remaining hours before dawn would determine whether any member of the expedition lived to report what they had discovered in the Appalachian peaks. Commissioner Marchant's pistol trembled as Drusilla Pembroke stepped into the firelight, her silver hair gleaming like frost on granite. 20 years of hunting, humans had carved something inhuman from flesh and bone. The moment had arrived when civilization's law would face the mountain's oldest justice. Dawn brought no relief to the expedition's survivors. Only the stark revelation that their night of terror had been carefully orchestrated preparation for a final confrontation. As gray light filtered through the pine canopy, revealing the scattered remains of their defensive position, the 8 remaining men found themselves face to face with their tormentor for the first time since the hunt began. Drusilla emerged from the morning mist like something born from the mountains themselves, moving with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws governing normal human movement. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, lean as a winter wolf, wearing clothing that combined traditional frontier garb with modifications that spoke of decades spent perfecting predatory techniques. Her silver hair was braided, with small bones, finger joints, teeth, fragments that told stories of previous hunts. But her eyes contained the most disturbing element of her appearance. Not madness, not animal ferocity, but cold intelligence that evaluated each expedition member with the clinical assessment of a butcher examining livestock. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of educated colonial society, overlaid with something harder, more primal. "You've traveled considerable distance to visit my home. I trust the accommodations have been educational." Commissioner Marchant stepped forward, hand resting on his pistol grip, though both he and Drusilla understood that conventional weapons meant little in this confrontation. "Drusilla Pembroke, by authority of His Majesty's colonial government, you are under arrest for the murders of Leopold Gainsworth, Reverend Sybil Renford, and multiple other victims." Drusilla's smile revealed teeth filed to points, a modification that served both practical and psychological purposes during close-quarters combat. "Murder?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Commissioner, you misunderstand the nature of what has occurred in these mountains. I am not a criminal violating your laws. I am natural law, operating exactly as nature intended." Her explanation revealed a philosophy that chilled expedition survivors more than any threat of violence could have managed. The mountains had taught different lessons. For 20 years, Drusilla had lived according to principles that predated colonial law, Christian morality, or civilized concepts of human rights. She viewed the Appalachian peaks as her territory, earned through decades of survival in conditions that killed weaker individuals. Anyone entering her domain without permission represented invasion, and invasions required elimination through methods that demonstrated superior adaptation to environmental demands. Every man who disappeared in these mountains died because he presumed ownership of land that was never his to claim, she continued, circling the expedition's defensive position with predatory patience. "Surveyors marking property lines through my hunting grounds, missionaries preaching salvation to families who survived perfectly well without European guidance, traders extracting resources from territory they never earned the right to exploit." Matthew Cope, the Mi'kmaq tracker, understood her reasoning in ways that his colonial companions could not. "She speaks like the old warriors," he whispered to Marchant. "Territory earned through blood, defended through superior knowledge, maintained through strength that proves worthiness." But Drusilla's territorial claims extended beyond simple survival philosophy into something darker and more systematic. She had transformed 20 square miles of wilderness into an elaborate killing ground, designed to eliminate colonial presence through methods that left no evidence for government investigators to pursue. Each disappearance had been carefully planned to look like accident, misadventure, or simple abandonment. Families fled rather than died, creating the appearance of voluntary relocation rather than forced displacement. "Your missing persons," Drusilla explained, represented different categories of challenge that required different solutions. Individual travelers could be eliminated directly, their disappearances attributed to wilderness hazards. Families required psychological pressure to encourage voluntary departure. Government officials needed more dramatic demonstrations of territorial control. The expedition was learning that they faced not a simple murderer, but a military strategist who had spent 2 decades perfecting asymmetric warfare techniques against colonial expansion. Marchant attempted to maintain official protocol despite circumstances that had moved far beyond normal law enforcement procedures. Regardless of your justifications, you will surrender and submit to colonial justice. Resisting arrest will only... Drusilla's laughter interrupted his formal pronouncement, a sound like wind through dead branches that carried no warmth or humor. Commissioner, you still fail to grasp the fundamental reality of your situation. You are not conducting an arrest in colonial territory. You are trespassing in my domain, where I am judge, jury, and executioner. Her words carried weight beyond mere threat. Backed by demonstrated capabilities that had eliminated half the expedition without conventional weapons or tactical support. The final confrontation began not with violence, but with negotiation that revealed the true scope of Drusilla's territorial ambitions. She had contacted colonial authorities not because she feared their expedition, but because she wanted to deliver a message that would end future incursions permanently. Take 3 of your men, she offered, gesturing toward the terrified survivors. Return to Trinity Bay. Inform your superiors that the Appalachian Mountains are closed to colonial development. No surveys, no settlements, no resource extraction. Accept these boundaries, and your people can live safely in coastal territories where they belong. The offer represented more than simple territorial negotiation. It was an ultimatum backed by 20 years of proven capability to eliminate any challenge to her authority. But Commissioner Marchant had not spent months organizing this expedition to accept defeat in its final moments. Drawing his pistol with steady hands, he aimed directly at Drusilla's chest, understanding that this confrontation would determine whether British colonial law extended into the interior wilderness or stopped at the edge of civilized settlement. The only message I'll deliver, he replied, is that no one places themselves above the Crown's authority in Newfoundland. Drusilla nodded approvingly, as if Marchant had finally provided a response worthy of respect. Then we understand each other perfectly, Commissioner. This is war, and only one side will survive to tell the story. What happened next would be remembered differently by each survivor, their accounts shaped by trauma, confusion, and the human mind's difficulty processing events that challenged basic assumptions about civilization's relationship with wilderness. How does a confrontation end when both sides possess right according to their own understanding of justice? And what happens when victory requires choosing between law and survival? The mountains were about to render their final judgment on 20 years of territorial dispute.